Thank you so much for joining the Spotlight on Internal Communication series that I run on my blog and my YouTube channel. And delighted to have you talk about communication innovation, which is a topic which really often doesn't get covered in a lot of forums. So before we get started, it would be great if you could quickly introduce yourself for our viewers.
Sure. My name is Mike Klein, and I am based in Reykjavik, Iceland. I have been working in the internal communications field since 1997 when I did my master's thesis on it on London for my MBA at London Business School. And I used to run political campaigns and do market research in the US before coming to London. And so, really, a lot of what I've done in my career is to take the techniques and approaches that I learned in politics and apply them in an internal comms context. And so, somebody once said that the definition of innovation is really when you take things from one discipline and you apply them and you find ways to apply them in another. So, in a way, I've been doing communication innovation for quite a while. And I also lead the We Lead Comms initiative, which recognizes communication leaders and communicators who take initiative in organizations and communities around the world. We've recognized 350 communicators in initiative so far and have over 4,100 followers around the world. And I also am organizing under the We Lead Comms banner a communication leaders survey so that communication leaders, and by leaders, I don't just mean people with director in their titles. I mean people who take initiative to move our profession forward, be it in their enterprises, in their communities, or in working with other professionals. And then I'm also organizing a masterclass on measurement because one of the biggest challenges that we face as internal communicators is that, in order for us to get the remit, the discretion, the authority to do what we need to do, we're demanded to produce data. But the data that we have doesn't suit the purpose of getting that kind of permission and support. And so, what I've developed for this masterclass, which I'm offering again in October, is a way literally to turn words into data.
Fantastic. I think, yeah, it's extremely creative work that you're doing, and I'm also delighted to be part of the We Lead Comms initiative that you have. And so, I wanted to ask you, there's a lot spoken about innovation and leadership in comms, and you mentioned the word initiative because it's also about how you can, take things forward, drive the agenda, reshape the agenda. So, how do you see the evolution of this domain?
Well, it comes down. I think the key to the evolution is that it comes down to us. It comes down to the communication professional because communication pros, particularly in organizations, tend to be very busy. And they tend to be very busy doing a lot of things that they're asked to do by managers, middle managers, senior managers who have very specific KPIs and very specific things that are stressing them. Now, the challenge is that many of these people think they know what the communicator needs to do and just simply want to delegate those tasks to them. The communication professional, on the other hand, has a much deeper understanding of what works and what doesn't. And so it's one thing to get an order from, say, the head of procurement saying, I want posters about the procurement change initiative on the walls on Monday. And to be able to say to that person, A, are you sure that you want that? B, what is it that what is it that your initiative is actually trying to do? C, can we spend 20 minutes discussing how I can actually help you get to this point? Or D, can you say, you know what? We've asked about procurement as an organizational priority, and 5% of employees have this on their radar screen. Are posters going to be enough to get you the change that you want? I mean, we need to take the steps required to improve both the quality of the conversations that we have with stakeholders and the data and the facts and the knowledge that we bring to those conversations. And I think all too often, many communication pros say, you know what, it's not worth the trouble. I'll just get these posters off of my desk and then get back to my real work. And the
Right.
problem is that then you feed the cycle of endless collateral and endless order taking.
Got it. That's very interesting because so what I hear you say is that it's a lot to do with how confident the communicator is in some shape and form in to have these conversations and to really move the needle and challenge the status quo. So what aspects really are core to, communication innovation? I mean, because it's not like every communicator is expected to create an app and, something really technology led all the time. But what are some of the key aspects of communication, innovation,
Well,
according
I
to you?
think the most important aspect of communication innovation is the willingness to learn, the willingness to listen, the willingness to find out what else is going on in the field, particularly.
Right,
Because one of the biggest problems that particularly senior communication professionals have,
right,
and senior internal communication professionals have in particular, is that they largely work in isolation.
mm,
It's very rare for somebody who's a senior or up internal comms professional to have other peers that they work with within their organization. Also,
right,
a lot of internal comms folk work under NDA. So there's a lot of resistance to being able to discuss the substance and the mechanics of the work that we do.
right,
So, the only input a lot of these people get are from their stakeholders that are asking them for stuff now.
mm,
And the stronger the relationships that we as practitioners have with each other, hence things like We Lead Comms, hence things like IABC, EACD, PRCA, the associations that, we started to dismiss a bit during COVID, we need them back because we need people we can talk to about how do you do this in a situation like this? How do you, and, it's not just leveraging best practice because by the time something becomes best practice, it's often stale already.
right,
It's about next practice. It's about having a conversation and in that conversation saying, okay, you did this, I'm doing this, boom, we create a combination of this and that. That's where the innovation occurs to a large extent. So the innovation occurs in the conversation. You were also talking about confidence. And I think
right,
that's a separate point that's worth almost its own entire discussion. For about 10, 15 years, from 2000 onwards, there was a
mm,
whole big conversation in the industry about the competent communicator. There was
right,
the Malcolm Black Belt course, the stuff that Liam Fitzpatrick, Sue Dewhurst were doing. Great stuff, but the stuff was really focused on getting people to feel that they're competent based on
mm,
skills.
right,
And the conversation that we have now needs to move beyond skills and move into strategy. We need to be able to convincingly say, not just that we can fix the problem that you're presenting to us. It's that we can say, you know what, you've actually got a different problem than
right,
what you realize. And that requires a much higher level of confidence. It requires a level of a business understanding of what the problem is,
mm,
to be able to, both to understand the mechanics of it and to discuss it effectively, but also the ability to present an understanding of reality that's based on data that may differ from what leadership thinks reality is.
got it.
And that's where you get into measurement. That's where you get into, actually doing some research into what your organization's like and what people's priorities are.
Right. So, what I hear you say also is that so it's not just about having the technical acumen. So it's also about the emotional competence that you bring to the table, and this balance is very crucial to be a confident communicator as a innovator at the workplace. So is that how you sense it?
Well, it's a combination of technical, practical, and emotional, and also knowledge based. You
Mm,
have to have facts. Even if you've got the most empathy for senior management, even if they like to take you out to the golf game, to the golf course every now and then, unless you're able to say, if we do this, either we will improve something by X, or if we do this, we will alienate 80% of the population. If you can't say that convincingly, you're not going to have a seat at the table, not because they don't like you, but because there's nothing you can add. Saying, well, our click rates will go up. Great. Tell me about EBITDA. Tell me about attrition. Tell me about attitudes. The employee engagement score and employee net promoter score. Tell me about some of these numbers that I care about. Click rates I don't care about because I don't understand how they fit into what they do. And part of the big problem that internal communicators have with data is that the data sets that we have commonly available to look at don't apply to specific organizational active outcomes.
Right.
An engagement score does not tell you anything about where EBITDA is going. An engagement score doesn't even tell you about where your employees are going. I mean, a lot of the companies which are seeing the quiet quitting and great resignation outcomes had engagement scores they were perfectly happy with. And part of the problem is because engagement surveys don't measure the kinds of trends that quiet quitting and great resignation reflect. They measure how people feel about their organization based on the extent to which people think there are right answers. If you ask somebody a question, do you think you understand the strategy? How many people are going to say no to that question? It's like a North Korean election. It's like, a lot of people don't trust the confidentiality of employee engagement surveys. And the extent to which they're willing to really open up is pretty limited. Now, that serves the survey's purpose just fine because executives like to say, we've got 82% employee engagement. That's pretty good considering all the other stuff that's going on. Let's keep things in perspective. Let's not have to deal with these problems that come up in the feedback. So the employee engagement surveys don't give us a lot of instinct about, okay, how can we actually impact specific business outcomes that are going to cause heartburn for our senior leadership? They only really address how people say they feel about the organization at a given point in time.
Got it. Brilliant. Yeah. And I heard you mention about measurement, and I know that you're doing a workshop on measurement as well in the coming days. So what is the role of measurement and analytics when it comes to innovation and at the workplace?
Well, I think the biggest innovation that internal comms folks can bring into the game right now is the ability to turn the words that they collect into data that management understands. And you can do this. There are simple and practical techniques to do this. If you've been trained in qualitative analysis, this is the time to brush that training off and put it to work. If you haven't been trained in it, come to me, I'll train you in it. Because when you can present words that say, for instance, you're in the sandwich business or you're looking at your canteen and you ask people to evaluate a sandwich. Three people say it's great. One person says it's yucky. So you get that, so you've got two words, great and yucky. You now have two numbers that attach to it, 75% and 25%. And then you can put it into a sentence. 3/4 of employees loved the sandwich. 3/4 of employees approved. Or you can say a double-digit percentage of employees disapproved of the sandwich. The key thing is you're now moving from the realm of your thoughts and what's going on in your head to being able to present to a senior leader that there are numbers of people whose views either correspond or don't correspond with their version of reality. And once you do that, you can say, here's what I can do to help move those numbers. So I'd say the biggest innovation is really being able to take the words that are going on in the company and turn it into data that you can take to a conversation with senior leadership to develop a partnership that allows you to influence the future course of your organization.
Got it. And we are now in a hybrid work environment, and how difficult is it or how hard is it to be innovative in this kind of a situation in an environment?
Well, I mean, in any kind of work environment, you've got different levers. In an office-based environment, you've got a lot of expectations about how you're supposed to look while you're working. In a hybrid environment, you also have a lot of those expectations, but they're different. How do you appear on Zoom? How do you engage with other employees when you're not in formal meetings? How do you meet people in the organization? Is there a role for internal communication and facilitating introductions between new staff, existing staff, and between functions and silos that don't naturally connect with each other? That's something that I call super connection. That's also something that I can offer, workshops and training and consulting on. How do you actually, as a communications person, go from somebody who's trying to navigate either a lot of visible rules as you have in a remote situation, or in an office-based situation, or a lot of invisible rules that you have in a hybrid or remote situation? And how do you present those rules to people so that they can follow them and therefore reduce the friction in the organization, or challenge them and maybe reduce some of the dysfunction in the organization that comes from the rules themselves? I think there's a huge role for internal communication in codifying the cultural and work practices in any one of these three situations, because an office-based situation might overnight become a remote-based situation again. And one of the things that we're seeing with a number of traditional companies that have gone fully remote, at least at the department level, is that they've taken their existing rules and culture out of the buildings, but the buildings still exist in people's heads. And then you bring new people into these cultures, and they've got no idea because they've got no anchor points for any of the references. Mm. So the internal communication folk could do a lot to codify, to streamline, to challenge, and also to include new employees in the creation of rules, processes, and practices. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that we need to look at too, when we're looking at remote and hybrid, is that the physical headquarters of the organization is no longer the headquarters. The headquarters is the set of internal communication platforms that you're using. And so it may seem easier, cheap, to just use Teams off the box, out of the box, Shelf out of the box, etc. And then what you have is chaos once you reach a certain maximum number of people. Hmm. And I work in the space, I work with one of the technology players, so I have a little bit of incentive to say this. But the reality is that your internal communications platform increasingly is your corporate headquarters, and you need to treat it like such. Companies would spend hundreds of millions of bucks on corporate headquarters, but they're trying to get it for free right now. Mm-hmm. The space in which to meet, the organizational systems with which to manage documents, the interaction, the communication systems for people who communicate with each other individually, in small groups, or as a larger organization. They're trying to get all of that for free when they would have spent $1 billion on a headquarters 5 years ago. And there needs to be a change in the thinking. And it needs to come from, to a large extent, internal communication folk who A, get this, and B, have the confidence to present it to senior management with conviction.
And Mike, as we wrap up, wanted to ask you, what's your advice for communication leaders, especially in this dynamic, changes we see at the workplace? And you mentioned about the great resignation and the quiet quitting, but also there are these crises like COVID-19 and the Queen's passing away, and the events around it. So are we kind of moving backward in some sense? So what's your take on it?
Well, I think these, COVID and, in the UK case, the Queen's passing, are massive events that require a lot of fairly basic internal communication support. People need to know, what the rules are, when things are happening, where things are happening, and when things have stopped happening. And internal comms is being tasked with this, as it should be, because it's a logical thing for internal comms to do. What's not logical is for internal communication people to say, great, we have a seat at the table now. The seat at the table is not bought with performance on very basic one-way distributional communication. The seat at the table is bought when we actively create partnership with other leaders and when we can get them to start listening to the insights we provide. That means we've got to bring data to the table that they'll buy and that they understand. That also means that we need to have the confidence to present that data with the same confidence that a CFO or an operations director would. I mean, one of my fraternity brothers from college posted a wonderful quote on Twitter a few weeks ago. And he said, there's been more fiction written in Excel than has ever been written in Word. The thing that we need to realize is not necessarily that our numbers are perfect, but that they aren't any worse than anybody else's. Everybody is making their numbers based on estimates, based on samples, based on instincts, based on their intuition about what's happened in the past and what they think will happen in the future. None of the numbers about projections, about forecasts are defined in actual, absolute reality. And so when we come up with numbers, when we come up with data, we need to believe that our data has every bit of right to be represented as anyone else's data does. If we can bring that to the table, I think that gets us into the ballgame.
Fantastic. Yeah, this has been brilliant, Mike. Thank you so much. I think these are great insights and great perspectives. I'm sure it's very, very valuable for our viewers. So thank you again for taking the time to